Hi, thank you for joining us for the end of year pension process webinar for 2024-25 Type 1 annual certificates. My name is Debbie Roberts and I work in the PCSE communications team, and I'm going to be helping facilitate this evening's session. Okay, so just before we do make a start, just want to let you know who we've got on the call this evening. So we have Katrina, who's our PCSE stakeholder relationship manager. We have Con and Lance, who work in the PCSE GP pensions team. And then you've got myself and my colleague Kat from the PCSE communications team. And we've also got Janet, our NHS England colleague, who's the performance and assurance senior manager. Okay, so we'll just have a quick look at tonight's agenda then. So we will start off with looking at who needs to complete the Type 1 annual certificate. We'll then have a look at GP accountant access in PCSE Online. We'll then jump into a live system demo where we'll have a look at PCSE Online. So we'll be looking at areas such as the employee contribution statement. We'll have a look at completing the Type 1 certificate in PCSE Online, and then we'll also show you how to find previously completed and submitted certificates. We'll then have a look at tier rates and the annualisation process. We'll then touch on reconciliation of under and on overpayments. And we've put questions at the end, but we will be having breaks throughout the session to have a look if there's any themes coming through, and we'll get those answered for you live as well. Okay, so to make a start then, we're going to discuss who needs to complete the Type 1 annual certificate. And to do that, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Katrina.
Thanks, Debbie. Good evening, everyone. So thank you for joining us this evening. Just to recap, I'm guessing that probably most people who've joined the session are already clear who needs to complete the Type 1 certificate, and that's hopefully why you've joined the session. But as I say, just to recap, so GP partners need to complete the Type 1 annual certificate, and certainly the 24-25 certificate if they've worked as a partner at any period during 1st of April 24 to 31st of March 25. And then if you're a GP partner and you've also completed any solo work or any locum work or both, then you submit all of that on your Type 1 certificate. Also non-GP partners, so non-GP providers also need to complete the Type 1 form. The Type 1 annual certificate, it may be that you have worked for a period of the pension year as a salaried GP as well. So the Type 1 annual certificate needs to be completed for the period that you were a partner, as I've just said, but you also need to complete a Type 2 self-assessment form for the period that you were a salaried GP. So if someone's a salaried GP from April through to, say, September, then, or perhaps they were a solo-only GP for that period, then they would complete the Type 2 form for that period. And then if they started in October as a partner, or they changed even at the same practice from salaried to partner, then the Type 1 form would be completed for the rest of the year. We'll come on to touch on annualisation a little bit later on, but if you have been Type 2 and immediately became Type 1 or vice versa, then you're continuous in the practitioner scheme all year, so you don't have to worry about annualisation, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. I just want to cover briefly the new accountants access in PCSE Online. So just a few key points. So some of you may be aware, you may have seen the communications that we have when the same day the Type 1 form for 24-25 went live in PCSE Online, so last Thursday night into Friday morning, then we also rolled out a new enhanced GP accountant access, and this was based and developed on following feedback from the accountant community who were feeding into us that it would be a lot more helpful if they could access the employee contribution statement of the GP pension scheme members that they acted on behalf of, so their clients essentially. Prior to last week's change, then if someone was given the old GP accountant role, then they could create a Type 1 or a Type 2 form for a member that they were acting on behalf of, but they couldn't actually see the employee contribution statement. So it's a brand new role, and the practice user administrator needs to link the accountant user to the individual GP pension scheme members that they act on behalf of. So you might have a situation, for example, where an accountant or an accountant firm acts on behalf of the partners, so they complete all the type 1 forms as well as doing the practice accounts, etc., but they may not have any role in completing the type 2 forms for the salary GPs. So in that instance, there would only be the practice user administrator would only link the GP accountant users to the partners and not the salaried GPs. And the information governance colleagues in both NHS England and PCSE were very clear that, as you can understand, then only access should only be granted where to data and information about members where it is warranted. So where the pension scheme member is, stating that this is the accountant acting on my behalf. But the role can also be that there are some instances where the pension scheme member may not necessarily have an accountant working with them, but maybe a financial advisor, and sometimes a practice manager or another type of representative that does work to support them to prepare their certificates or the type 1 or type 2 forms. So anyone that the GP or the GP pension scheme member says to the user administrator, yes, I want this person or that person to be able to access my statements, then the role can be given, but it is with the acknowledgement and confirmation from the GP or the pension scheme member themselves. And just to cover off, there are some quite large accountancy firms that work with some practices, and they may have multiple members of their teams that work with it or might need to work with an individual practice and the members that are part of that practice. So the accountant role can be linked, more than one accountant user can be linked to the same pension scheme member, and similarly, or in reverse, if a pension scheme member has more than one type of person supporting them, then they can also have that role. So I think the thing that changes is that if you have an accountant or had an accountant acting on your behalf in previous years, then if they had that role previously, you will need the practice user administrator to link them to you as the pension scheme member so that they can access the employee contribution statement going forward, but also if they are completing your type 1 form for you on PCSE online, then they will need that role to be linked to you before they'll be able to do that for this year. So make sure that you speak to the user administrator at the practice. It's a one-off task. It takes less than a minute to do, but they do have to do that before your accountant will be able to get that access. So we wanted to cover that off because it is very new and some people may not be aware of it. So we're going to just play a short video just to show what the accountant is able to access when they have been assigned the role. I'm going to show you how the GP accountant user can access the PCSE Online employee contribution statement and create type 1 or type 2 forms for GP pension scheme members that they have been linked to in PCSE Online. So once I have logged in as the GP accountant user, then I click the pensions and payments tile, GP pensions, and then first of all, we'll have a look at the employee contribution statement. So once I have entered the employee contribution statement screen, then I enter the GP GMC number and we will enter that. I can also search by NI number or NHS pension scheme membership number. So this is our test GP, and if we scroll down, then we simply select the financial year that we want to look at. So I want to look at 24-25, and I click search, and then I will see all of the income, pensionable pay and monthly contributions for my client. The GP pension scheme member may have different types of income,
And if they do, perhaps they have some solo work or locum work, then I'm able to filter on income type, and I'll see different options if they do have multiple employment types. So I can filter on that or filter on practice and click the search button if I want to see the totals. But I can also scroll down to the very bottom of the screen and click download CSV, and that will provide a CSV version of the employee contribution statement that I can save and refer back to. I can also then go back to the GP pensions tile and choose, this time, annual certificate type 1, because the pension scheme member I'm linked to has type 1 income. So if I click type 1, annual certificate forms, then I'm able to again enter the pension scheme membership number for the member that I am linked to, click on that, and then I can start to complete the type 1 form as normal. So I need to select practice and then select the financial year. Let's say I want to do 24-25, and then I'm going to start checking all of the details and completing the form. So this shows you the access that is available to the GP accountant user when I'm searching either on the type 1 or type 2 screen or on the employee contribution statement screen. Then I will only have information returned for pension scheme members that I am linked to as an accountant. So if I haven't been linked as an accountant by the practice user administrator to the GP pension scheme members that I act on behalf of, I won't be able to see any of that information. So we need the user administrator to take that action initially, and following that, once they've confirmed that you've been linked to the pension scheme member, then as an accountant, you'll be able to log in and use this functionality.
Okay, so I can see just a couple of questions that do relate to the accountant access. So accountant access for members that have opted out. So the user administrator is able to link accountant to any of the pension scheme members that are active in their practice, so are active members in their practice. So if they're currently opted out, then they won't be able to do that. So that's something that we are looking at for the future. And there's another question about if a GP then does leave or retire, a pension scheme member leaves or retire, then the link isn't broken. There are various videos that we published on YouTube just showing the user administrators how to manage this access and add accountants and disassociate the link between an accountant and a member, etc. The link would remain to the pension scheme member, unless there's a request from the member to the user administrator to the accountant has either changed or they don't want the particular accountant to have access anymore. So going forward, if somebody retires in the future or opts out in the future, that link would still be there. But in terms of being able to give the access for the first time, as I said, at the minute, it's not possible to do that if the GP's already or currently opted out. So I think we're on to the system demonstration. Just to say, the video that we just showed there about the accountant access, that actually showed the first part of going to the PCSE online type 1 form and completing that initial page. This test GP partner, we've logged in to the system. So we've got the employee contribution statements that we're going to look at first. So what you see is, again, it's all test data, but when a GP or a pension scheme member themselves logs into PCSE online, then if they go to the employee contribution statement or they go to the type 1 form, their details are auto-populated in the screen. So they can see all of their own identifiers. The demo video there showed that when an accountant is logging in, if they would be searching for the member that they need to look up or look at the data or complete the form for. But you're logged in as a GP pension scheme member, so the details have auto-populated. And on the employee contribution statement screen, I think we saw it on that video, but the user is able to select the relevant financial year. If this GP had contributions going back to 15, 16, 16, 17 or whatever, all of the years from that era were migrated from the old NHS system. You can't see contributions for things like 2010, 11. The member needs to go to their pensions online record if they need to check that for any reason. But you've got all of those years going back to the migration data from the old system, and then everything that's been happening in PCSE Online since this system went live, which, believe it or not, is June 21, so it's getting on for quite a few years now. But if you're looking at 24, 25, then the member can just then simply click search. And what they'll see is they'll see a month-on-month display of all of the income, pensionable pay or pensionable profit in this case, and employer contributions, employee contributions, then any AVCs, total at the bottom. And what was mentioned on the video there is that so this is a GP partner and they're solely a partner, but if they had a solo role or, if for several months of the year they were a salaried GP before that, if we just click search, then everything that's been recorded for that particular year will be displayed. And then what we can do is we can filter on income type, and we'd have different choices if we had multiple income types. We can filter on that. We can even select practice if there's more than one practice, and then click search. So it just gives the ability to display, certain roles one at a time if that's helpful and that's what's needed. But from an accountant perspective, what is usually the most beneficial and most helpful is just to go straight to and click the download CSV button when you've got the full search, and then all of the data from this employee contribution statement downloads, but it's in a CSV spreadsheet that's easier to filter, sort, do checks on than just a kind of screen that we're looking at. But the visual display from a GP point of view, just to be able to see that month on month, we're not suggesting that people wait until it's certificate time before they actually look at their employee contribution statement. That's available to members at any time and will be available to accountants as well, so they'll have plenty of time to prepare for the certificates in future years. So that's as simple as that. That's all, that if to access that information, that's all we need to do. So we're going to move straight on to the type 1 form. Now, what we've then got is the annual certificate button, and you'll have two options. So one is to complete a certificate form for where we haven't started to complete it, so we're just going to get into it for the first time. And then this other button is a button that's really useful for a number of reasons, and this is the listing screen. So what we do with the listing screen, if we click on that, then what this will show us is any certificates that have been submitted and approved. So even if they've been submitted through the contact us route, so last year when the system wasn't available to submit type 1 forms, if the type 1 form came in on what we would call a paper form and it's been processed and approved, that will show on the listing screen. Any submissions via PCSE Online, even if they haven't been processed by PCSE yet, then they will also be displayed, and then any draft submissions. So as a GP logged in, then the scenario we've got here, if we just click search, then we have our 24-25 form in draft. So I've created that a little while ago today with some test data just to help us kind of speed up the demo. But it's useful to see that we can see the draft here. We go along to the end, and if we just think, oh, don't know what I put there, I want to start again from the beginning, then you can click delete if you want to, but most likely you will click on the hyperlink and open the draft. Before we do that, I just want to take us back to the annual certificate forms button. So as you saw on the demo video, if I hadn't started to complete the annual certificates, then the year in question is available for selection and off I go. But in this scenario, because I've started to complete a draft, or I've started to complete a form and saved it, which becomes a draft, then when I scroll down when I'm in the certificate screen, select my practice, which is what I always need to do. But if I'm going to try and select this 24-25 year, what we'll see is it has this slightly strange message, but it says already initiated, completed. So it means that it's either been started or fully completed. That's what it's trying to say in a limited number of characters. But we know we've got a draft, and that will not let me go any further on this screen. So if you see that message, you may even have just completed the first couple of boxes on the form, but you would see that message because the draft has been saved. And so all you need to do is go to the annual certificate button again. So you're in the main GP pensions area, go to your annual certificate button, but instead of clicking on the forms button, you click on this listing screen. We do our search, and then we have access to our draft. So all we need to do is click the blue hyperlink, and that will take us to the form. So I'm just going to go to the first page, the main member details page of the form. It's pretty standard. The details that are captured there are very similar year on year. But what I mentioned earlier on about the members' details have auto-populated here. The practice that I selected when I started to complete the form has auto-populated, and the financial year, I can't change any of that there because I've gone in initially through the 24-25 form. If it's another year that I want to do, then I go back to the main screen and select that year and carry on from there. So all of these details are auto-populating. I don't need to take the time to fill them out. So, that's much quicker than having to go to the NHS Pensions website, download the Excel form and then start, manually creating all of the details. There are fields that need to be completed or confirmed or just bypassed if they're not relevant to me. So you've got the practice accounts year end, you've got a box for private fee if that is relevant. If the GP started during 24-25, so it just defaults to the first day of the pension year. But if it was that this GP became a partner, partway through the year, then that would be the start date of the role rather than the 1st of April. There's a box to confirm if there's been a retirement or an opt-out date, or if in fact I've left the practice during the year. So again, that's there for me to complete if that's relevant. And there is now a box that the GP or pension scheme member has to tick if they've taken partial retirement. If an earnings cap applies, again, the usual confirmations if it's a provisional tax return. And then there's another button now, and this just mirrors any minor changes that NHS Pensions made to the 24-25 form. So if it's an amended certificate, then there's a button to complete. So as we work through the form, you'll see there's always a save and next button at the bottom of each page that you've completed. So you would move on. You can just click save for later. So if you get to open it, you start it and then you think, right, I need to go and check some figures, or I've not actually got time for this right now, I just wanted to have a look. Save for later, it'll be there in that listing screen, and you would go back to it. So because I've started this earlier, then you'll see that this menu down the left-hand side, that a lot of the sections have a tick on them. Now, that means I've been through those sections already. If I need to make changes to any of the figures that I put in here, then I can go in and click and do that. So let's just take the first example page. So I've entered here that the income, the share of income is £80,312.12. If I need to change that because I've gone and checked the figures are different, then that's fine. What we're assuming is that either your accountant or advisor will log in and complete all of these sections that relate to the calculation of the profit, or you will have all of these figures from your accountant or advisor if you choose to complete the form as a member yourself. So, it's not PCSE's domain to start looking at how profit is calculated and what needs to be recorded. You've got your guidance on the NHS Pensions website that kind of takes you through the Type 1 form, but we've gone through as an example and just populated this form with the figures that are the minimum figures that are required to take us to the point where we start looking at employee contribution tiers. And this is where we need to start thinking about, have we got the right tier rate, and have we got the impact, what's the impact on the contributions. So what you will see when you're on page 6, and it goes pink to show you the one that the page that you're on. If you click on view tier rates, this works in the test environment anyway, yes it does, then it displays the tier rate table that's relevant to the year in question. So we're in 24-25. And for those of you, anybody who's not as familiar, compared to a few years ago, then the number of different tier rates is now condensed. That's one thing. So there's not as many different options, but also the salary or profitable pay income that you need to have reached to be on the top tier. So the top tier is lower than it used to be. The top tier is now a tier rate of 12.5%, but you only need to have earnings of £62,925 or more to have reached that top tier. So it's just referencing the tier rate table, but what you'll find is this example, we've got 70,215.18 there, so we're above that 12.5. This example, the GP doesn't have any solo income, but if they do, then they will have already entered it in box 40 on the previous page. Any locum income needs to be entered here, and any type 2 practitioner pensionable pay, so it says already pensioned at source. We talked earlier on about you still need to complete a type 2 form if you did have a period where you were a salary GP, but for the purposes of calculating the tier rate, it needs to be declared here as well. So I think that's where some people get confused, because it says to add it here, then some people think they don't need to complete a type 2 form, but if you were a salary GP for part of the year and then became a partner, or vice versa, you do, unfortunately, for that year, have to complete the 2 forms. But you need to record your type 2 practitioner pensionable pay if you have any, and as I said, your locum as well. So you would find that by entering figures in here. So we've got 70,215. So if we had, let's just say 5,000, then you'll see that the practitioner pay then jumps to 75,215.18. So I'm just going to take that locum out because the GP doesn't actually have any locum earnings, but just to show you how the form is dynamic, it does the calculations for you when you enter the figures in the relevant boxes. And what you'll see now is different to previous years. Then the system, or the form in the system, has been programmed to automatically look up that tier rate table for you. So it's automatically defaulted to 12.5, and it said if you've earned over 65, whatever that threshold was, you're immediately on to 12.5. Now there is also this 59A and 60A, and this is where if a GP pension scheme member has only worked for part of this pension year as a practitioner member of the scheme, so let's just say they did opt out partway through the year, and they then come into one of the categories where they need to annualise their income to calculate the tier rate. We'll get onto the NHS pensions annualisation calculator a little bit later, but what you would find is if the annualisation calculator came out with the annualised earnings was 150,000, then what you will see is the tier rate will be automatically populated. Now, in this instance, this example, that doesn't actually annualising the income doesn't actually make any difference. The GP was already above the threshold for the top tier rate, but let's just say our GP was, the earnings for the period that they did work was 40,000, which would have put them on one of the lower tier rates, which I think this carries through to all the pages. Yeah, it does. So if they were on 40,000, then, if that was the income for the whole year, then it would be 9.8%. But if that's then plugged into the annualisation calculator because they only were in the scheme, maybe they opted out, so they were only in the pension scheme for part of the year, then if that then took the annualised income, to a higher tier rate band, then that will automatically populate. So if you have worked the full year, continuous, then you ignore 59A and 60A is auto-populated anyway. But if annualisation applies, then you've now got this part to complete on the form. So that's a slight change. Going on to saving next, we can work our way through that if I'd made a change, or I can work my way down the menu, whichever is easier for you as an individual. So we're now getting to the part. So I'm going to hide this navigation menu so that we can see, and again, that's just handy to know that you can do that so that you can see the full display, the box there. Again, just for anybody that's not familiar, then what the Type 1 form does, and this is based exactly on the calculations are working the same way as the NHS pensions form, really. We've already looked at where the tier rate comes from, so the 12.5% defaults in there. The system then calculates what is 12.5% of what was my pensionable pay that was declared earlier on in the form and finalised earlier on in the form. That comes out to be 8,776.90. This figure here in box 69, this comes from the employee contribution statement, really. So this is what's been deducted for the GP through the practice monthly contractual payments, and that's based on the estimate the practice submitted just before the start of the pension year. So those monthly contributions that are deducted from the practice are based on the estimate that the practice has submitted before the start of the pension year. This is what these total. This form is about calculating what's based on what my true pensionable profit was rather than estimated, and then what the correct tier rate is, what are the contributions that are due. And then there is then the calculation column that says, what's the difference here? So I am due to pay 8,776.90. What's already been paid is 8,429.40 for employee contributions, and that means there's a difference or a shortfall of £347.50. It is displayed as a minus figure on the PCSE system. You can see there that is the difference between what was due and what's already paid. If I had an added years contract or any AVCs, then you've got the other rows that are then again populated and completed for those elements. But if we jump straight down to employer pension contributions, employer rates that goes through the practitioner scheme in terms of the administration through the Type 1 form anyway is 14.38%. So again, that's applied to the 70,000 odd that we said was the pensionable profit. That comes to 10,994. What has been collected through the estimate process and the monthly deductions is 9,720. So again, we've got a relatively small shortfall here of 399.74, bringing a total shortfall of 747.24 when we add the employers and the employees' contributions together. And when this is checked and processed and reconciled by PCSE, as soon as that is updated to approved, then in the next contractual payment following the form being approved by PCSE, then in this instance, this £747.24 would be deducted from the practice in the contractual monthly payment. It will show on the monthly statement. It shows it as an adjustment due to employee contributions, and due to employer contributions separately, so they can clearly see what it is and which GP it is, etc., which partner it is, and which year it's for. But and this is a relatively small adjustment in the grand scheme of things if it's a busy practice. There are some instances where the practice estimate has turned out to be really low for what a GP has ended up earning as the profit share, if you like, and declaring on the Type 1 form. And this can become quite a significant sum. So, clearly if it's practice accountants are involved in preparing the Type 1 forms, then they will be giving the practice a heads up and, they'll be expecting all of that. But we do get some instances where if GPs are completing forms for them, themselves in submitting them, if the practice isn't aware that they've gone in and what the calculations have come out as, then they sometimes get a bit of a shock when they get that adjustment. So there is a bit of a plea to make sure that if it's not the practice accountant that prepares your forms, that you make sure the practice has got a sight of, this is what these calculations are coming out at. Clearly, if it's been an overpayment, then it's a sum that will go back to the practice, and that might be a bit more welcome than arrears being deducted. But as soon as the calculation of arrears is done, the NHS pensions rules are the arrears need to be collected at the next available opportunity. So that's why it is in the next contractual payment run. And just to mention, if our GP had any solo income, then we've got a pretty much identical table really that goes through the different types of contributions related to the solo income, and there'll be the difference in total under or overpayment there. And what we need to remember there then, so if we just do save and next from here, then when we come to the additional information page, and I do want to discuss that in a second, but I just wanted to, we'll be able to go back, take us to, whilst we were thinking about somebody who did have solo. So when we get to the declaration page, then you'll see that we've got two options in row P or box P and box Q. And if a GP pension scheme member, so this GP pension scheme member doesn't have any solo work, so it will default and stay defaulted to everything being deducted through the main practice contract, because that's all the earnings that they're declaring. If they do have solo work, then the GP is able to opt to not have the solo reconciled through their practice contract, but we'll come on to that in terms of reconciliation a little bit later. But in general, most partners will opt to have their contributions reconciled through their main practice contract, and then they obviously sort that out when it comes to the accounts in the practice. But there is the option to tick either or. So if it's we're collecting through the main practice contract, then we can proceed. But if it's going to be that the member wants to reconcile the solo through the solo provider, then that actually needs to be done, and we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail before we can take the certificate through to being approved. And then we've got this consent declaration where there's an agent detail being provided on page 9. So that's just giving consent to the agent receiving information if we've got any queries regarding the certificate, and then maybe submitting that and completing that as the final declaration. But I want to just take it back go back on the navigation menu and take us to the additional information tab again. So here, if there's anything relevant that you think might be worth adding to as information for PCSE to take into account in relation to the forms. So, if the members opted out and opted back in, or opted out partway through the year, or even retired, anything at all like that, then this box 95, adding the notes there is helpful. You can provide the details of the accountant or other agent that can act on behalf of or receive correspondence on behalf of the member. And there is also an upload file button. So if, for instance, our GP had completed solo work, then it's prudent to attach a copy of the annual solo form when submitting the type 1. So when we're using PCSE Online to submit the type 1, then we've got this functionality to just choose a file. This little up arrow is then clicked as the upload button, and that means that when the submission comes through to PCSE, all of the data that we've been entering will come through, but so will the attachment. So the file that we've uploaded will come through as an attachment. So if there's anything that you need to or feel would be helpful to submit along with the form, either complete information or add the attachment. And what we're really focused on is trying to get the forms processed without having to come back and forth and ask questions and queries and, why is this, it doesn't, that doesn't match with our records, etc. So if there's any relevant context, so you can see anything unusual in the employee contribution statement that you weren't expecting, etc., use the notes box to your advantage so that we've got that information, and at least in some occasions that will avoid us having to then come try and have a dialogue with you about what we've found that doesn't allow us to immediately approve the form and get the record up to date, because ultimately what we want to be able to do is get the pension record up to date, and until the type 1 form can be successfully reconciled and accepted and approved, we're not able to do that. So if we jump back to the declaration page, then if we click to complete that declaration, and that's just a message to remind us to check the values before we click submit. Just going to hide that navigation menu again because it's much easier to use your form and see all of the information. So we've got the total contributions, the summary, and all that will happen next is we'll click submit. You can see there's a print button there. If you're not too worried about saving the planet, you can save it, print it if you wish, but I'll leave that for you to decide. You can save it electronically. As soon as you've submitted it, it is saved electronically, and it's there for you to go back as many times as you need to on the listing screen if you need to check anything, so you don't actually need to print it, but obviously that's up to the individual. So that has now submitted. You can see that our declaration button has greyed out. It's populated with today's date because that's when I've submitted it, and we are done. So go back to the listing screen, research again. Then what we can say is we have got our form, but instead of the status, declaration status saying draft, it now says declarated. And what that means is you've completed the declaration, completed it as a proxy to sign in because you've been logged in as the pension scheme member to do that. And that's now through with PCSE, waiting for PCSE to review it. If the accountant or an accountant user completes the type 1 form for you, they can complete it all the way up to that declaration page. And when they click to finish their stage of it, it then sits in your listing screen with a status of pending. So you would go to the hyperlink again, open that up, check that you're happy with everything that's been completed for you, and then again tick that declaration box. So you're then logged in and you're completing the declaration as the member, and so it comes through to PCSE then, and that's declarated. So that's one thing to remember. And then the other thing I want to mention while we're in this area is you can see here, and you do need to scroll along to see this. So when we did the search on the listing screen, it displays like this. And I think some people don't realise that there is a little arrow here that and a bar that we can scroll along. And then we get 2 more columns. We saw earlier on that when I had a draft, in the action column, there was the option for me to delete. That's gone now because I've submitted this. There's no going back from that. It doesn't mean I can't do anything in the future to change it or to resubmit a different version. But right now, this is waiting for PCSE to review, and I need to wait for them to review it, and then it will come back to me, hopefully as or update to show it's approved, or they may need to contact me with a query, and hopefully in very rare circumstances, but if there's anything dreadfully wrong, it may need to be rejected so that something can be corrected. But that's what we're trying to avoid. But you can see that there is this other column that says revert to draft. And if you have a rejected form, so if you have, and this might be a rejected form from a previous year, and you might be wondering what to do about that and how to get it resubmitted. So if the status says rejected, there will be a little icon, it's like a sort of circular arrow thing. A little icon appears in this revert to draft column, and you click on that. And what that will do is it still keeps the initial submission because it's important that we've got the data integrity, but that then creates a new draft for you to start and make any necessary corrections. So that is one of the most common reasons that people, or this not understanding how to navigate the listing screen is the most common reason that we get calls from GPs into our customer service centre who feel like they've hit a block or a blocker when they're trying to do their type 1 or type 2 form. And it's because either, there's something here that they need to go back and create that draft to do their updated submission, or very commonly, then it's because, and I mentioned this earlier, but I'm just going to mention it again in case anybody has joined really late. When we go to complete the type 1 form, if the form's already in draft or it has been completed on the system previously, then it will show as already initiated or completed. So even if it's a draft, as I said earlier, with just, the personal details, you will still get this message. You can understand why people aren't used to using PCSE online to complete their forms. They see that and they panic thinking, what on earth's going on? All they need to do is go to that listing screen and click the search button, and then they'll find the form at whatever status it is at. So that should really, help clear that up for anybody that's kind of come across that. And the last thing to mention on the listing screen is kind of the opposite, really, not the listing screen, the certificate screen. We also get people worried that they go to this screen, select the practice, and there are years available for selection that they already have submitted and can see an approved form for. Now, and they see the approved form and they go to the listing screen and they think, well, it's got read as if it's available for selection. Why is that? I've done my form, you've processed it, what's going on? The reason for that is if the previous form, the form that was submitted and approved previously was submitted as a paper version, as in it was submitted through the Contact Us form and not the system still allows the selection, but it's the listing screen that gives you that record of what have PCSE actually got processed for you. Don't worry about what's read and what's not read on the form selection screen. It's get that listing screen. Now, clearly, when people have been submitting forms and we talked about, data being migrated, somebody might be, 15, 16, 16, 17 or whatever, or before that in the scheme, but you would see, they would see the 15, 16, 16, 17 forms. You're now getting on to having quite a long list, especially if you've jumped around from being type 2 to type 1 year and then back the other way another year. You've got multiple forms. And this is only a test example of one form, but what is really useful is that you can click on this financial year arrow and the list will sort in financial year order. So depending on how your mind works, if it's anything like mine, I just find that really helpful to be able to then immediately have all the forms that I know that I need to submit, all the years that I was either type 1 on the type 1 screen and type 2 if you've got any, the type 2 screen if you've got any type 2 years. Are they all there and showing as approved? Because if not, then it means that I'm going to have a gap in my record currently and I need to get the missing certificates, the certificates for the years that I needed to submit a certificate, but either I haven't managed to do that in the past or I have and there was a problem reconciling it and we've never got back to going back around that again. By submitting any certificates that are for the years that are causing a gap in your record, and once we get that gap resolved, because the NHS pension system can only be updated in sequential order, it's just a system restriction, sequential year order. If somebody has a gap, maybe 17, 18 was problematic at the time or they hadn't got round to it, maybe every year after that, 18, 19 onwards, right up until now, is showing on the listing screen, they're all approved, all looks great, but hang on, we've got that gap. When they go to pensions online and they look at their NHS pensions record and statements and so on, it will look as though they don't have a record updated past the year before 17, 18 when the gap occurred, so 16, 17. And, that can feel quite frustrating. But the reason is because, PCSE Online has all the data for all these years that we processed. There's no concern, there shouldn't be any concern in that respect. But we need to be able to, resolve that gap year, or if it's more than 1 year, but we need to resolve the gaps to be able to then add on all of the sequential years, all of the data that we've got for the member for these, from these happily reconciled certificates. We need to be able to add all of them on in sequential year order once that gap has been resolved. So, when we're reviewing the records, or when you submit certificates, then if you get communication that says we do need to resolve a gap or gaps for you, it may be frustrating if you think, well, back then I had an issue with that, and I didn't manage to get it resolved, and that's it's a real pain. But by getting that back into us and us working through it with you, then it means that that gap's resolved and we can just move forward, and then year on year it's a lot more straightforward after that. So I think that probably takes me to the end of everything I wanted to cover in the demo. Lots of detail and information there, and just pause to see, have we got questions in relation to the submissions?
If you do have any questions that pop up that you've not thought about tonight, please do leave a comment on the YouTube video. We do check it daily, and then we will respond to you within the YouTube comments as well. There was another question, Katrina. I think it's somebody that must work as a partner and maybe have a salaried role. So they were asking if a Type 2 form is required for other salaried roles, such as an ICB clinical lead.
So depending on the contract that the person who's the ICB clinical lead has, whether it's a contract of service or contract for service. Contract of service, it would be pensioned as officers, so it wouldn't come through the practitioner scheme at all. The ICB will be able to keep you right on that. But if it's been if it's a contract for service, then that should be through the solo route if you're a Type 1 partner as well, and then you do the ICB solo work, or ICB clinical lead role, sorry, that would be pensioned through solo. The ICB, you should see when you go to your employee contribution statement that you've got profit share income against each of the months, and then you should also have solo income and the ICB uploads that data monthly to the PCSE system when they pay your pension contributions over. So when it comes to the Type 1 certificate, then there is a box for you to declare any solo income. So you declare the total amount of your solo income, and then that gets added to your partner income on the form to get your total pensionable income, which then, as we said earlier, drives your tier rates and then drives that calculation of the contributions due. And when we had the system demo there, we talked about there is a separate section that then populates for the solo calculations. So it's all captured on the Type 1 form if it's an ICB clinical lead that has a contract for service. There is one that I just want to touch on. I think somebody's asking if we can go through an example of the calculation that takes us to the pensionable profits in box 39. So we've avoided doing that because PCSE aren't medical specialist accountants and don't have that remit to give any guidance or advice on how to arrive at your profit. So there is guidance on the Type 1 form on the NHS Pensions website, and that kind of takes you through each section. So hopefully that helps. But if you're unsure, then seeking advice of a specialist medical accountant would seem like the right thing to do. There's a question about how to resolve gap years. So just to recap, we look at the listing screen, and if there are any years that you were a partner in the Type 1 listing screen, but you haven't either submitted the certificate, there's no approved certificate, then you would submit the certificates for the year or years in question. So you can go to PCSE online for any of the fairly recent years, and by recent I'm going back as far as 15, 16, and submit on there, except for last year for Type 1, so that's like the last pensionable year, so 23, 24. If it is 23, 24, then you need to complete the form from the NHS Pensions website and submit it by the Contact Us form. And like I said, when we've processed your certificates for your missing years, then we're able to, in the Pensions Online system, update the record in sequential year order for all of the years. If you had periods or pension years where you were a Type 2 GP, so you were salaried, instead of being a partner, then the type 2 listing screen on PCSE Online will again show you what we've got processed and approved. If there's anything you've submitted recently and you've done that on PCSE Online, it might show as declarated like we showed, so that means it's waiting for PCSE to review. But if we don't have your certificate, you've not sent it in to us recently, then you would submit your missing forms, and that's the route to getting your record up to date. And then every year thereafter should be very straightforward. Okay, so let's just move on to the next couple of slides then, just to cover a couple of things that come up from time to time. So tier rates then, on the tier rate slide, I think we've covered this really, displayed the table when we were in the type 1 form, and this is, it can happen that especially when people have had maybe a portfolio of different roles across the year, changes in roles and things like that, if it turns out that at the end of the pension year and when your type 1 form is being completed, if it turns out that you've paid contributions on a tier rate that is lower than it should be, then you'll have a shortfall that needs to be resolved, and we'll come on to that. Or if it turns out that you've been paying contributions on the highest tier rate because it was expected that you were going to be over that top threshold of 62,925, and it turns out that you only came in on, let's say, 45,000, then that would take you into the bracket of the 9.8% tier rate. So it is, if that's the outcome of the completion of the type 1 form, then there'll be an overpayment that would again need to be resolved. So if we just go on to the next slide. So this one is just a quick flash up of the NHS Pensions annualisation calculator. This is available on the NHS Pensions website. In this example, so we've got an example here, probably of a GP who's kind of opting in and opting out. So they had a type 1 post that they were opted in the pension scheme from the 1st of July 24, but then they opted back out again from the 28th of February. So what they need to do is, because they haven't been superannuable for the whole year, then they need to complete the annualisation calculator. And there are instructions and guidance on the NHS Pensions website on how to do that. But in this very simple example, then you can see that in the calculator, we have to select whether it's type 1 or type 2 or locum. So type 1 is what it says in the tin, you've been a partner. If you've had any type 2 income, then that's going to either be a salary post in a practice or you've had solo work. And then if you've had periods of locum work, so there are scenarios where somebody may have been a partner for a certain period of the year, but then they've ended that role and they've maybe done some locum work here and there. That then needs to be added into the calculator. And for the locum work, it's the start and end of each period of engagements. And this is all set out in the NHS Pensions guidance. But as you go through, if you've got multiple rows to complete on the calculator, then you'll see that there's the button on the right-hand side of the calculator that says add row. So if you need to add multiple rows, you work through that. And then you click the calculate button. And what you'll see there, it's a bit small potentially, but the earnings for a GP for the period was 42,500. But when that information is plugged into the calculator, that takes the annualised pay to 63,837. So if we think about it, if that GP had selected or considered that the tier rate was only based on what they actually earned, the 42,500 would have then in the 9.8% category, but actually the annualisation calculator tells them that they need to pay employee contributions at 12.5%. When you need to annualise, and the scenarios that you need to annualise in, that's based on the NHS pensions rules, and that's all detailed in the guidance on their website. But it is important, if you come into any of those scenarios, that you do that so that contributions on the type 1 form are being calculated at the correct tier rate. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, please. This is just a screenshot of the NHS Pensions website that has a whole load of useful information, but this is showing you in the Member Hub that we have the annualisation calculator in the section that's headlined as GP tiered contributions and annualisation calculator. So let's move on to the next one. We're just looking at under and overpayments. So I've talked a bit about scenarios where we end up with under or overpayments of contributions. So that's either the estimate that was submitted before the pension year turns out to be either too high or too low, or the GP has been on the tier rate that we thought should have been on, but actually it turns out they should have been on a different tier rate when everything is all considered for the different roles. So in that scenario, when we talk about and look at the partner income, so the role they've got as a partner, then when the type 1 form is processed and submitted, and is processed by PCSE, then if it's an overpayment, then the practice will receive a refund in the next contractual statement after the certificate's been processed. If there's been an underpayment, then arrears will be deducted from the practice in the next contractual statement. And we talked about if it's a significant amount that needs to be deducted, then it's good to make sure that the practice manager, etc., are expecting that. Solo income, I talked about when we got to the solo section on the type 1 form demo. We need to have the relevant box ticked to say I'm going to get my solo reconciled via my main practice. That's one option, and that form just then carries on and it all goes through in the next contractual payment. But if there is an underpayment and the box is ticked that says I'm going to reconcile with I want the form to be reconciled with my solo employing authority, solo provider, then PCSE would be contacting the provider to say there's arrears to be paid if there's an underpayment, and we need to wait for that payment to be received before we can carry on processing the form and get it approved. If there has been an overpayment and the box is ticked to say reconcile via the solo provider, then a separate refund goes to the solo provider. The only exception to that would be if the solo work has been done for an NHS England region, because the GP's worked as an appraiser for the NHS England region, then the rule there is that the refund would go direct to the GP, but only if they haven't ticked the box to say, let's get it all reconciled together. And then finally, locum income. The GP themselves would have been paying their own locum contributions, submitting locum A and B forms during the pension year. So if there's an underpayment, then PCSE will advise and you need to pay that shortfall as the GP. And then if there's been an overpayment, the refund would go back direct to the GP. So I'm going to just touch on this. The instruction and guidance from NHS England is that the process and the system is all set up to automatically calculate any arrears or overpayments for practitioner income for practices, so for partners or salaried GPs. And so the expectation from NHS England is that the practice then waits for that type 1 form to be processed by PCSE and then for the deduction or the refund to take effect through the next following contractual payment, as we've discussed. There are circumstances where practices or practice accountants have said, we can't wait for that. We need to, for whatever reason, get this payment made now, immediately. So we do have a template that if there is a circumstance, and it should be an extreme circumstance really, but if there's a circumstance that says that payment needs to be made, then the template needs to be completed and the BACS reference needs to clearly identify who the member is. The way we identify, or the BACS reference needs to identify the member, is by using their pension scheme membership number, so the 8-digit pension scheme number. Clearly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 is an example of a dummy fake pension scheme member. But then it needs to be followed by the letters YEND, which is short for year end, the astute among you, and then the first 3 characters or letters of the month and the year. So I think I've left an extra 5 in there, so apologies for the typo, but that should say Y end and then MER and then 25, and that would be March 25. So it's a year-end payment that needs to be applied at March 25 is what that's saying. And if a payment's being made, template needs to be completed, and the template should be submitted with the type 1 form. So you saw earlier on the demonstration that there is the additional details page on PCSE Online Type 1 form, just the way there is a tab in the Excel version. So when you're submitting on PCSE Online, then that additional details page has an upload button for you to be able to upload attachments. So anything like this needs to be uploaded there. Otherwise, we run the risk that the payment, the certificate's processed before the payment has actually been identified, and there's a risk of duplicating the deductions. Like I said, the clear guidance is that the expectation is that the process is allowed to go through its natural course, which is to take or make the adjustment through the contractual payments, but any payments that are made need to be clearly identified, and they need to be the supporting information needs to be sent in with the Type 1 form. If somebody can't use PCSE Online for any reason and they are using what we'd call the old-fashioned route, so the Contact Us form, then again, they'd submit that template, anything else like an annual solo form or whatever, as additional attachments when submitting the certificate. So I think that takes us on to key points slide. Yep. So one thing to just reiterate, key thing really, is the deadline is 28th of February for submissions as normal. Hopefully this evening's demonstrated that it's quick and easy to get your form submitted, and using PCSE Online, lots of things that you don't need to complete that are auto-populated, and all the calculations are done there. All your data is auto-populated. Employment details need to be up to date. This is a key point for partners who are GP partners. So if you've been a relatively new GP partner at a practice, then you need to be fully attached, if you like, to the practice before you're able to get your Type 1 form completed, selected on PCSE Online and completed. So if you find that you go to the Type 1 screen and the year's not available for selection, your practice isn't available for selection, then if you go to your employee contribution statement, we should have really done that in the first instance, but if you don't have contributions then for the practice, that means that something hasn't been fully completed in the processes that need to be done when you first become a partner. So that process, just to recap, starts with the GP themselves going to the performer record in PCSE Online and completing an employment change. So there's an employment change option, which when they open that up, they would enter the practice that they're starting at or had started at and the date, etc. That's submitted. Because they're a partner, the current process, change in the future, but the current process is that the practice and the ICB need to approve that change, to acknowledge it. When that's done, then the practice needs to complete a pensions joiner in PCSE Online, and the pensions joiner is where your initial estimated income for that year that you started, tier rate, etc., is completed so that deductions can commence. And if all of that's done in a timely fashion, then by the time you come to submit and complete your Type 1 form, or the first Type 1 form for working at that practice, you won't have any issues. But if you go to complete it and you're not able to select the practice, etc., and there's no contributions on your employee contribution statement yet, then check your performer record. The GP should check their performer record. If that's showing that you've got your employment assignment approved in your record, then the next thing to do is to go to and speak to the practice manager to say, well, the joiner hasn't been completed, so we need to get that done. If you go to your performer record and you either haven't completed or that employment change, because maybe you weren't aware that you needed to do that, or you've completed it but it's showing as pending, then you either, if you've not completed it at all, you do need to complete it retrospectively and get that process moving before you can submit a Type 1 form. Or if you have completed it and it's showing as pending, then again, you need to speak to the practice about getting that approval. So those things are only relevant if you're not able to complete the form, and either in that particular pension year or just before that, or or the year before, etc., you changed role at the practice or joined the practice, you may not have had all of the processes completed. So it's just to point that out really, because that's probably the other thing that we get most queries about. And lots of guidance on that process on the PCSE website, and then also lots of guidance around completing the forms, type 1 forms and type 2, if you've had 2 roles, on the PCSE website. And I've mentioned various guides are on the NHS Pensions website, including the annualisation calculator and the guidance associated with that. So I think that's the end of the slides.
There's one question going back to the GP accountant access. So someone's asked if there's a pension scheme member that has opted out of the pension scheme, can they still be assigned a GP accountant to look at the employee contribution statement and all the details?
Thanks, Debbie. I think we did touch on this question right at the beginning when we were looking at the access. So, but just to recap on that, there isn't a way currently for accountants to be linked to members that are opted out, if they're opted out right now. If they access and they're linked now, and then the member opts out, next month, 5 months, next year, then that link will still remain. But they don't currently, if the GP or the member is opted out, then that's something that we're having to look at to see whether there's going to be a way to do that in the future. But at the moment, there isn't a way to do that. But I think there's a question that I can see. We've talked about really we shouldn't be receiving the back payments, but if they are made, then to make sure it comes in, when the certificates land in, because PCSE only gets an updated list of transactions that land in NHS England's bank account on a weekly basis, then making that a little bit in advance of the certificate coming in would be the safest way to do that. Again, kind of very specific one about back payments and waiting for them to process through before submitting the certificates. That the best thing to do is to submit the certificate and let the system do the calculation and get the adjustment applied that way. But yes, if you are going to submit a payment, then it needs to play through and then submit the certificate to avoid the risk, that a double set of deductions are taken because of some overlap.
So Con's mentioned in the chat, mainly if we could just discuss around annualisation. Mostly, when would somebody need to annulise their pay?
Yep, so just to recap on that, so we gave a bit of an example. The example we gave, I think, on one of the slides was GP is someone who opts in and out of the scheme. So they were opted out until, let's say July of the pension year. They were in the pension scheme and opted back out again, say February. So they haven't been superannuable in the pension scheme, or the practitioner pension scheme anyway, for the full pension year. So any circumstances where the GP is not superannuable in the practitioner scheme for the full year, then they need to annulise. So the common one is that the GP has been a registrar or trainee and then has a substantive post. That tends to, as a GP for the first time, partway through a pension year. The trainee and registrar roles are pensioned as officer in the scheme, so they're pensioned directly and don't come through the PCSE system. But then if the GP if they do start their first role as a partner, then it would be a type 1 form and they would be annualising for that year. In our experience, they're more likely to need a type 2 form because they go into a salaried or a solo role first, but they could go straight into a partner role. And if they do, then they'd be type 1, but they would be annualising because they haven't been practitioner in the scheme for the full year. If the GP has retired, so what happens for retirements? I don't know if there's anybody on the call who has retired, or maybe might be some accountant representatives on the call who've got members but who've retired. So at the point when the GP retires, we have to make sure that the records are fully up to date, and that includes having all of the certificates completed and reconciled for all of the years that a certificate's been published. If you think about it, if somebody retires now in January 26, the most up to date we can get certificates completed, or they can complete certificates for, is 24-25. So the 25-26 year would currently be updated on the record based on estimated earnings and contributions. That's the way that the rules work. But when, and their application goes through and they have the reward calculated, etc. But when the pension certificate is published for the 25-26 year, that member will still have to complete a type 1 form to declare their actual earnings. So, but in our example, if it's 21st of January 26 that they've retired, then that's another example where they would be, on their type 1 form, where it asks on the personal details page, essentially, if you haven't been in the scheme for the full year, if you've retired, put the retirement date, and then you would then be saying, right, okay, that's GP's not been in the scheme for the full year, so they need to annualise. So any examples like that, opted out, retired, just had a break, been off doing something else, maybe it's an academic role that's been an officer role, and then, the member has come back into normal GP land, if you like, and has, taken on a partner role, then they'll have a type 1 form, but maybe they didn't start till kind of May, June, July, January. We get the odd person, occasional person who has taken on a role, I don't know, like the 21st of March or something, and they have to complete the type 1 form for the sake of the 10 days, but they do, and then they need to annualise that. We've also got it the other way around, where people are ending their role, but they don't end it till maybe the end of the first week in April instead of the 31st of March, so they find themselves having to do a type 1 form for a few days into the start of the year, and that has to be annualised. So lots of examples.
That's great. Thank you, Katrina. Just another theme that I've seen coming through. So if we have a GP or a pension scheme member that has gaps in their pension record, or what we'd call missing years, what's the best way for them to go about getting that rectified?
So just to recap on that, you will see on PCSE Online, got certificate missing, you would go to PCSE Online to complete that certificate, and it's back to 2015-16 or anything after 15-16. If it's a really historic year, then there is a amnesty type version of the type 1 form on the NHS pensions website. If it's an older year than that, hopefully it's not, you're not having to go back to your records that are way back then, but if it is, then it would be a download it from NHS pensions website, submit it through the Contact Us form, but all the years from 15-16 onwards should be available for you to submit via PCSE Online, except 23-24, that was a one-off year where we only have a paper form, so again that would need to come in via Contact Us if that's the year that's missing.
Lovely, thank you. So yeah, we have someone that's asked if their income has increased significantly, when's the best time for them to update their estimated earnings?
So as soon as in the pension year is the best time to do it, and as soon as you know that the estimated earnings is going to be greater than you initially expected. So the estimate process on submitting estimates on PCSE Online, so the practice users that have got the roles to submit estimates, it's a really easy process in the first instance. And the deadline for submitting the practice estimate for the pension year is also the end of February. So the practice users that have the estimates role complete the estimates, submit that, and then from the April contractual payments onwards for the pension year, that then calculates and dictates what contributions are deducted for each of the members in the practice. If any of the members then are going to have an increase in, maybe the proportion of the profits, so you think, we need to get this increased in terms of expected income or expected pensionable profit, then a revised estimate can be submitted at any time during the pension year. So it could be a couple of months into the year, it could be much later in the year. And what that does is it will, for the remainder of the year, base the monthly calculations of deductions and what's deducted from the practice on the new figures. So that could be a new estimated income for that practice role, for that partner role. There could also be the scenario where someone is a partner with limited sort of proportional profit, and they then have a separate role that they take on partway through the year elsewhere. So it could be an out of hours role or, clinical lead for an ICB. And they could be thinking, actually, I was expecting to come out with, say, something like 30,000 for the year, which was going to put me on this particular tier rate. And that's what the practice have got these deductions coming off it every month. But if the partner then, explains to the practice manager, because I've got this other role, I think I'm going to end up over the higher tier rate threshold. So really should be 12.5%, then the practice can submit the revised estimate. It might be that the estimated income for that practice is the same. There's not any expected change to that of the, say, 30,000, but the tier rate can be revised through the revised estimate so that, again, the contributions are then being deducted for the rest of the year at the higher tier rate. And that just means that when it comes to the end of year forms being submitted, the adjustments that need to be calculated to reconcile and bring the contributions up to date, collect the arrears that are due, they'll be less impactful, they'll be smaller, and practices then find that easier for cash flow.
Lovely. Thank you, Katrina. I think we've got time just for one more. It is a basic question, but it might be something that other people do think about. So if somebody had opted out for the whole pension year, did they still need to submit the Type 1 form?
No. Straight answer. No.
Just to clear that up, that's fine, thank you. Some people might think that they still need to complete it. But yeah, we are coming up to the end. So I'd just like to thank you, Katrina, for going through that demonstration. I hope that was really helpful for everybody. We've got a wealth of information on the PCSE website, which is available for everybody to view under the resources section and also under the GP pensions tile, which you can access from the services tab. But that's it from us. I hope you found it beneficial, and I'd just like to say thank you for joining us.